Hello, this is Ebbie Smith, and I'm trying to make the recording and commentary to go along with the PowerPoint. I will give it to you slide by slide. On slide 1, it is just saying what our course is and who I am. Slide 2 gives you the information about the writer of the textbook, Richard Schaefer. It tells you the title of the textbook, which is a lie. It says Sociology, a Brief Introduction. It tells you when the book was published and by whom. The fact of the matter is that any edition of this book will do you for this course. Don't buy a brand new one that costs $1,000. Buy a used one or buy an older one, and it will do you every bit as much good. Slide 3 tells you something about Schaefer. The fact that he went to DePaul University and holds a degree from Northwestern simply says that he has been connected with very good universities. His race interest was in race relation, and you noticed he has been president of a society. That means he's sort of something in the world of sociology. In slide 4 tells what he gives as advice to his students. You can read those. I think it's good advice. My main goal in this student is that we become better persons who react better in the groups in which we function, so we will all work together for that. Slide 5 begins to give the outline of the course. This is rather important because it'll make it more sensible to you. Our first unit is the study of sociology, or the field of sociology. And in the textbook, this material is covered in the first part of Chapter 1. We will learn the definition of sociology, something of a matter called sociological imagination, and the social institutions. The next slide gives us the second unit, the rise of sociology and social theories. In this unit, we study how sociology came to be and the different theories or ways of looking at societies that different people have developed. Unit 3, on slide 7, sociological research. Now this is chapter 2 in the textbook, and sociological research methods, very important part of sociology, because much of what is done in sociological study is done through research projects that we will want to understand. Section is a little more difficult. This is Unit 4, and we call it the Foundations of Society. Notice that it runs in several different chapters in the textbook, and the next slide shows that Chapter 3 in the textbook is Culture. 4 is Socialization and Life Course. Chapter 5, Interaction, Social Groups, and Structure. And 8 is Stratification and Social Mobility in the United States. These are aspects of every society. Every society has to take care of these matters, but they'll do it in different ways. We will study these in rather with difficulty, but in some detail. Notice Chapter 8 in the textbook is stratification, but the writer does deal with the stratification or inequality in 3 subsequent chapters. We will not have time to deal with them very much. The 5th unit that we will study is social institutions. This also is covered in a number of chapters in the textbook. On the next page, slide, we see social control and deviance. Social control, the police system and the court system, helps to keep peace and to control people. Family, religion and education, government and economy, health and environment. These are all different aspects of the social institutions that we will study. The next slide, Unit 6, is social change, and that talks about how cultures change and how they stay the same. We will deal with it somewhat, but we will not actually get to this. The next several slides simply give you a breakdown of these various units that we'll be studying, and we come to slide 18 that just tells us we've got a long way to go and no time to get there, but you watch old Ebbie run, we're going to get it. So we will start and get going as best we can. Our study actually begins with slide number 20, which tells us about the field of sociology, indicating that we're going to be studying what sociology is. What is the meaning and definition of sociology? Notice slide 22, the name of sociology. Sociology comes from two words, as we see in the next slide. Socio is from the Latin word socius, which means living together, people living together, associating. And ology comes from the Greek word logos, which means word, but it also means the study of. So as it says on the next slide, together the words associate or sociology and logos mean the study of humans living together in groups, and that basically is what sociology is. Professor Snoopy studied teenage behavior among the Amish, and that was obviously a sociological study because he was looking at behavior in a group. Professor Careful did a study of a group who was finding a way to raise chimpanzees to supply organ transplants for humans. This is a fanciful thing, but it's not impossible. Was this a sociological study? No, he was studying the science of doing something with inanimate beings. Professor Nosey studied how testosterone and low levels of it in males could affect marital relations. This, of course, was a sociological study. It was talking about family and relationships. Now, the next slide talks to us about two branches of sociology. This is a matter that's very often mentioned in the textbooks: micro-sociology and macro-sociology. Micro-sociology is the study of individuals and their interaction with others in society. It's very close to psychology. Macro-sociology, on the other hand, looks at groups without undue attention to the interaction of individuals. What happens within groups? Emil Durkheim, as we see on the next slide, used these two terms very early in the history of sociology, but it was Robert Merton who in later years made these really important in sociological literature. The terms micro and micro sociology are very important in functional sociological theories. However, I would want you to know that the sociological theory symbolic interaction is a micro-sociology approach. So, where did we get sociology? Where did this come from? Slide number 29. Well, here is a definition that actually comes from our textbook. Sociology is simply the scientific study of social behavior and human groups. It focuses on social relationships and how these relationships influence people's behavior, and how societies, the sum of those relationships, develop and change. I think the writer left out the fact that sociology is also going to look at the institutions in which people live, things such as social control and family and government and economics. Schaefer in our textbook gives this list of factors that make up sociology. It's a scientific study. We're going to look at that very strongly in the next few minutes. It focuses on social relationships, relationships within groups, considers how those relationships influence and shape people's behavior. The fact that you live in certain groups makes a difference in how you behave and how you look upon life in general. It seeks to understand how societies develop and change, and it looks at these societies as the sum total. The next few minutes we'll be studying in detail some of the matters that grow out of these statements. I would add that sociology should help any individual to recognize, there's a mistake, and the importance of the social groups he or she relates to understand way he and she might contribute more favorably to the society, and how he or she might avoid causing distress, disruption, violence, and conflict or loss in the society. I would like for you and for me to look at ourselves and think about how we live in different organizations, different groups, and how we either contribute to the safety and effectiveness of the group or how we cause disruption. What do we do that makes our groups better? What do we do that causes our groups difficulty? And how can we change so as to be a better member of those groups? That is the primary goal I have for this course, and that is why I think this course should be the most practical that you take. How can I be a better nanny, nurse, accountant, police officer, or whatever I happen to be? The next slide gives us some overviews of sociology. It starts out with this idea of the scientific study. We're going to do that idea in more detail in just a minute. But we have to ask, how do sociologists make certain that they are considering the correct data? If we gather information about a certain group and their behavior, but we gather it from just one small segment of the group, we might come to a conclusion that this group acts this way when they really don't. See more about that later. Sociology is a behavioral science. A natural science studies things that are physical, chromosomes and atoms and things like that, metal and its strength. Behavioral science studies how people act, and it's therefore a much more difficult study. Sociology studies how we live together. The question is sometimes asked, if a guy is marooned on the island where there are no other human beings, can that person do anything wrong? The fact of the matter is that he's there by himself. There are no rules and no people for him to do harm to. Therefore, can he do any wrong? It's an interesting question. Sociology is the study of the institutions such as family, education, government, police care, police force, law enforcement, all of this. How do these institutions regulate behavior? The next thing is it studies order and disorder. Why do people obey the rules of societies? Why do things keep going smoothly, even though some people don't want to obey all the rules? And finally, why do things stay the same and why do things change? This is the material of sociology. We're going to be studying now the definition of sociology. Notice on slide 35 the 7 elements that would go into a definition of sociology. I would suggest you sort of commit these to memory and learn to use them. Number 5 is a little badly stated here. Sociology is a different way of looking at the world and world events. It's a way of trying to make sure that we're making the correct judgments about what we see and what we hear. We'll get back to that. Okay, let's start. The elements in the definition of sociology. We now know there are 7 of them. And the first is something we keep fooling with, and that is a scientific study. I probably will send you a detailed statement of this next little segment. I've got it in a better form, but let's look at it as we have it here. Professor Nosey and Professor Snoopy are both concerned about the students at Tarrant County College and what they eat for breakfast before they come to morning classes. Professor Nosey stands in the parking lot and asks the first 10 students what they had for breakfast and decides if these were good breakfasts. From a scientific studies point, he did a terrible job of choosing who to ask. The first 10 students may not be representative of the whole group. You need to make a selection of people you ask the question for that will let every person in the population you're going to study be the one that might answer the question. Also, Professor Nosey didn't know what a good breakfast was. How did he just made his mind up in his opinion, so that didn't work. Now, Professor Snoopy gets a list of students, and he numbers them, and he selects 50 from this list in a random way, and that gives him a random sample. He then gives these guys a questionnaire about their breakfasts. Now, of course, Snoopy did a much better scientific study than Nosey did because of the sample. But wait, Professor Careful did the same thing Snoopy did. But Careful wrote a description of the items that would make up a good breakfast and a system to evaluate from 1 to 5 and constructed a scale into how good a breakfast it was. He wasn't just using his idea about what good breakfast, he was getting something that could be quantified. He was then able to compare the answers from the student on the questionnaires to the scale of a good breakfast. Now, this is the primary thing he did that was much better. Here was the description of a good breakfast. He figured this out, and he decided, with some help from studies, that if a breakfast had 18 points out of the possible 25, it was a good breakfast. What this is called is operationalizing. When you take a complex idea and put it into a scale that you can say 1 to 5 or 1 to 6, and that will indicate the good or bad, that makes it possible for you to use that information better. So an operational definition is an explanation of an abstract concept in a specific way so that you can use the material. Sometimes this is the same as putting people in high class, middle class, low class, working class. But operationalizing helps a great deal. Now, Professor Wright, he did the careful selection that was mentioned. He operationalized the scale of a good breakfast. He completed and tested the questionnaire. That's something the others may have forgotten to do. He gathered the data. He used the questionnaire. He analyzed the data, but here he did another matter. He wrote an article describing his conclusion. This article was published, and he got a great deal of feedback. This last matter of publishing and feedback made Wright, and by the way, sometimes I spell Wright W-R-I-G-H-T just to be funny, but Wright took his findings and compared the breakfast to the students who had eaten good breakfasts and their grades during the study, and he found that the grades of the students who ate good breakfasts were higher, and that a correlation existed. When Wright reported this, he didn't say that a good breakfast causes the students to make better grades. He said there is a correlation that exists between them. You see, the fact that two things happen at the same time doesn't mean that one caused the other. For example, one man made a study of the number of drownings and the amount of ice cream that was sold. He found that the two correlated. During the season of year when more ice cream was purchased, there were also more people that drowned. His problem was he decided that eating ice cream caused drownings. Of course, the reason was because they both occur in higher numbers during a special part of the year. But this is the idea of a scientific study. When we think of a scientific study, we think a person who actually gets real facts before he or she makes up his mind. There's a very interesting book that's pictured here in slide 43. Where am I wearing? Note not what, but where. Kelsey Timmerman noted that so much of the clothing that we wear is made outside of the United States. He went to these places in Mexico and Honduras and India, and he studied what was going on, the factories and where people were, and he came to these concepts. He said our clothes is made in other countries. The people who make them in those countries are real people with real problems. And he said the economic situation is vastly uneven. The workers in these factories in other countries are seriously underpaid and uncared for. He found that there were often unsafe conditions in the factories where the work went along. He was very critical of us for exporting our work to these other countries. However, he didn't notice that social networks affect my clothing. He didn't even mention this, but he also seriously didn't mention, does outsourcing help the economies and peoples of the undeveloped countries? They receive far lower wages than they would have here. But after all, halitosis is better than no breath at all, and this situation allowed the people to have a certain amount of job and income that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So it's not totally negative. Now, in summary, in slide 45, the study, if it's scientific, is based on actual data that can be verified. We know this is true. It's carefully gathered. It's gathered from groups that are carefully selected so that we get the right idea. We thoroughly analyze the data by taking very good care of it and then studying it from a standpoint of not to prove what we think is right, but to prove from the standpoint of what actually is happening. And then we share the information and try to learn from it. So sociology is first of all a scientific study. It gets real information from real people in genuine ways and carefully gathers it, analyzes it, and shares it to get feedback. Sociology is a scientific study. Secondly, sociology is one of the social or behavioral sciences. Now, natural sciences, as we see in the next slide, studies the features of nature. How do these physical matters react and change? If you put together hydrogen and oxygen atoms in the right way, it will produce water. If you pour water on potassium metal, it will explode because it allows so much hydrogen to be released so quickly it generates heat and explodes. Chemistry, biology, physics, geology, to some degree mathematics are physical science. Social sciences, on the other hand, look at behavior, the behavior of people, the customs, the rules, the institutions, the values, how these people change. These behavioral sciences are made up anthropology, psychology, economics, political science, and history would be among them. What is the primary difference between natural and social sciences? Well, we're talking about people. And which of these is more important, natural or social? I would have to say both are important for humans, but let's never look at the chemist as being more of a scientist than the sociologist or the anthropologist. In fact, as we'll see later, the reality of studying human behavior makes it very difficult. Here we have a list of the behavioral sciences. We've added one that we didn't mention earlier, archaeology. The next slide will help us to understand more about behavioral sciences. By the way, when we look at this, we all say together, that is a great chart, because the instructor made it, and so it looks good. Archaeology studies prehistoric societies, and notice primarily it does excavation. They dig up the ruins left by people and try to study something about their culture and the way they did things. Anthropology is the study of existing cultures and societies. Usually it's a society other than the one the studier has grown up in, and the primary way of studying for anthropology is called participant observation. It means going and living one whole year with a group of people to find out how they live. Psychology studies individual behavior, and a lot of experiments that are done, which is a primary way of studying for psychology, are used in both psychology and sociology. Economics studies how a society produces, uses, and distributes the necessities of life: food, shelter, money, goods. The primary is observation and analysis of production and distribution. Political science studies the institutions by which societies govern themselves. It investigates social control. The primary method is observation and analysis. History, on the other hand, studies the events and movements with an analysis of the significance of the events. What caused this to happen? What was the chain of events that led to this? The next chart is equally good because the professor made it, and it helps to see the difference between sociology. For archaeology, they study prehistoric societies. Sociology studies societies that are now. Anthropology usually studies across cultural rather than in the studier's own culture. Psychology does individual, while sociology looks at entire societal groups, be it a big society or a subgroup. Economics looks at material matters, production, distribution. We would study, sociology would, how these factors influence societies and the behavior of people in those groups. Political science studies arrangements in political power, while we notice the influence of different structures on social relationships. History notes events and movements, while sociology studies the influence of these events on social relationships. Here's a little, in slide 53, a little review, and if you would just go through and name those for yourself. If you have trouble, look back and see that, but it's a little checkup on this matter. And the next slide shows how the global depression in 2008 might have been viewed by a historian, an economist, a political science, a psychologist, and a sociologist. Notice the sociologist would be looking at what changes in marriage patterns are observed during this downturn, what increase in people beginning educational programs, what changes in religious practices were recorded, what difference was seen in people seeking medical care. Another chart that can help you. The next chart just leads you to do some thinking. How would a historian, a social scientist, or a sociologist differ in their study of these different events? Talk to yourself about it, and if you would like, talk to some other people in the class. Element 3 is a study of humans living in groups and having social relations, and how these relationships make a difference in our behavior. Notice in the matters in slide 57, different societies influence the relative importance of social relationships. A family, in large family, your extended family, for some groups have very deep importance. Uncles, aunts, cousins, very important. In others, relatively unimportant. Different societies put different importance on social relationships. Relation of mother and father, father and son, differ between different groups. Some societies differ in the various behaviors and meaning of these behaviors. I discovered when I came back from Indonesia in 1974 that something had drastically changed. I had been raised that a man opened doors and let ladies walk through first. I began trying to do that at University of Houston, and the young women were very upset by it. They saw that behavior as putting them down, and they would stand and say, "No, you go first," and would get quite upset about it. Various behaviors have different meanings in different societies and within a society at different times. Different societies determine the seriousness of violation of some practices. You can wear one kind of clothes in one society and nothing is thought about it, but if you wore that same clothing in a different society, you'd be thought of as being very immodest. When I was in high school, the girls were never allowed to wear jeans or large shirts. Once a year, they would always wear jeans and shirts in a planned protest or special day because the society at that time said they were not to wear jeans or large shirts in public. Different societies make a difference in the determination of the nature of social relationships and behaviors at different times in their society. When I was in high school, there were no African Americans in our classes. We lived in a horrible, segregated situation. There was a different school for the black children. It was not a good setup, and thankfully our culture has overcome it, and so things are better now, although we're not completely over this problem. But different societies have different determinations of what's right and wrong at different times. Now, 58 looks at how sociology looks at things from a little different way. Why does the bride wear white? Well, it is supposed to symbolize purity. In our day, today, what do you think the possibility is of a woman this age of having no sexual experience at her wedding? We've changed some there. Look at the next slide. Here is a lady in Anglo society with one baby, and she's very happy about it, and the baby doesn't look too disturbed. The other is an Asian family, and they are very pleased with 4 children. You see, the American society sort of limits the number of children because of financial and other reasons. The Asian society says, "Oh, children are a blessing, we need to have more of them." The next slide. Notice that this shows the rate of death by suicides by race and gender. Obviously, Anglo men are much more likely to commit suicide than any other group. Black women are the least likely, percentage-wise, to commit suicide. Says something about the group we live in having something to do about our actions. In summary, sociology looks at the importance of social relationships. One sociologist that we will study is convinced that suicide was caused by people not having good relationships and not by anything else. Sociology wants to understand why some relationships are considered important in some societies and not in others. It seeks to understand the influence of relationships within a society. So, how do we live within groups? This is the matter that sociology is going to be studying. Elements in the definition, element 4, sociological imagination. This is a statement or a phrase that you'll hear in every sociological book. Sociology is a science based on this concept of the sociological imagination. Note the next slide that gives us the person who did this. C. Wright Mills wrote this book, The Sociological Imagination, in 1959. It has become a classic in the field of sociology, and you will read about it in any sociology book you pick up. C. Wright Mills taught at Columbia University, one of the best universities in the country, and he said that our individual identities can be understood only within the social context of family, jobs, friends, and circumstances. The sociological imagination that Mills taught us that we had to see connections and context. When we see the connections between our individual identities and the social context, we will find out more about how we live and what kind of people we are. Sociological imagination, says Mills, is a way of seeing and connecting biography to history. Here are the features of sociological imagination as taught by Mills. Set of mind that enables individuals to perceive and understand the relationship between their personal lives and the historical events. It's one thing to know that there's a great deal of unemployment in our society. It's another thing to have just lost our job. What is the connection between our losing our job and the society? Sociological imagination helps us to understand the effects of social forces on our lives and decisions. Why did the man refuse to stand during the playing of the national anthem? Because he saw social forces that were discriminated against his people, and he wanted to bring it to light. Understanding that enables us to reach autonomous decisions rather than just conforming to existing ideas and values. We say, I now understand why they want me to do this and why I either want or don't want to do it, and so I can make a better decision. Sociological imagination is a viewpoint that helps us to more completely interpret current events and pronouncements. Why is this happening? Why are people feeling this way? This is what we need to know. It is the awareness of the relationship between the individual and the wider society. Helps us to think about our immediate personal settings within the social world. We understand it's not just us, but our society. It's not just, does this help me, but does this help my group? It helps us see our society as one from an outside might see it. Let me give you an example. In Indonesia, I traveled one evening to a village out from the city, and they were in great excitement. They were having a cockfight, and everybody was just very excited. They had two roosters with knives attached to their legs, placed in cages, and trained to fight each other, and they just cut each other all to pieces, and people were betting on this one and that one, and everybody was excited, and I was almost sick to my stomach. I was just terribly bothered by it. That same week, I got a tape of the Super Bowl. I invited some of my missionary friends and some of my my Indonesian friends to come and see the game. A guy went over the middle and caught a pass, and somebody wiped him out. It was a horribly violent collision. The Americans leaped and screamed with excitement, "Great hit!" The Indonesians were horrified. Why would one person hit another person that hard? You see, society helps us to say, we understand the background of the two people. The Americans and the Indonesians saw the practice of a cockfight or a football game differently. It empowers us to look beyond a limited understanding to see the world and people in a new way. As a Baptist, I have been taught that smoking was bad. It's bad for your health and not good to be done. But nearly everyone in Indonesia smokes. I was somewhat critical from my background until an Indonesian told me one day, you know, when you're hungry, smoking helps you not to feel so hungry. I realized from their standpoint a difference. It helps us to understand preferences. If I brought the music I like and played it to a class, you would be very bored. I'm driven up the wall by the music that most people the ages of our students like. It's a matter of culture and sociological imagination. Here are some advantages. Actually, Montague, a sociologist, said it enables us to avoid cyclosclerosis. He says that's a mental condition that keeps people in groups from accepting new ideas. It's a frozen mind. He says sociological imagination can help us to see things from other people's viewpoints. It helps avoid the problems of Plato's cave, where people were tied, imprisoned, and allowed only to see reflections, so they never saw the true proof, the true nature of things. It liberates us from stereotypes, a good thing. The next several, my own sociological imagination. I was 10 years old on Pearl Harbor Day. I was playing out in the street, and my friend's mother came and told him that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. Didn't even know where it was. But during the next years, I was bombarded with information that the Japanese could not be trusted. They were sneaky. They were mean. I was raised not trust Asians. Thankfully, I have overcome that in the last several years. Living in Asia in 15 years helped a great deal, but my sociological imagination had to change. The events around Pearl Harbor had led me to one idea. Hey, if you were taking this online, and you are, you will be asked to write a short paragraph giving the basis or reason from some aspect of your sociological imagination. Now, don't get uptight. You'll do okay. Just try to express what you think your sociological imagination in some regard is part of your life, and what situation caused it or led to it. It'll be a fun thing. We'll look at it together. Okay, element 5. The development of clear thinking. Sociologists helps us to think clearly by avoiding either or thinking. Basically, it's a different way of looking at the world, societies, and peoples. It's a way of saying other people have a reason for feeling like they do. Today, we hear a great deal about police brutality. On the other hand, we read a great deal about people refusing to obey the rules and to live by the guides that we have in place. I understand how some people would feel that they are being mistreated, but I also feel that other people have reason to think, well, if someone's disobeying a law, they are going to be punished. Either or thinking will very often lead us to errors. Both and thinking will often help us a great deal. Well, what are the differences in both and either or thinking? Well, here are some questions that we have. Every American has a right, it's in the Constitution, to use and own firearms. It's a constitutional right, and the government has no reason to limit it or control it. There's one view. The other is because firearms cause so much damage and are used in so many criminal activities, the ownership and use of firearms should be severely limited by government. Now, if you take either or, you probably will be wrong in what you decide about this. But if you can look at that from both standpoints, people have a right to firearms. If only the bad people have firearms, we're in trouble. But on the other hand, there needs to be some control so that not so much bad will happen for them. Somewhere between both and can help. Abortion is taking a human life because the fetus is basically a human being. Abortion is therefore an action that should never under any circumstance be considered. That's one view. The other, abortion is a woman's own decision between her father, the father, and her physician. Women have a right to an elective abortion if the situation says it's best. Take either one of those without anything from the other, and you might come to a decision that would not be best for people. Perhaps there's some truth in both. Here are some things that sociology can show us, would give us a sense of perspective. The American Indians in the early days of the colonialists from England had a problem. The colonialists suggested to the Indians, hey, we'll educate your children. The Indians said, no, you won't. Well, don't you want them to learn to write and think and speak correctly? The Indians said, yes, but you won't teach them how to grow corn or fish. They must know this. Perspective. The colonists thought that learning to speak and write and have proper manners was very important. The Indians understood you had to learn how to make things. I had an experience while my wife and I were living in Indonesia. We lived next door to a single lady missionary, and she invited my wife and I and the pastor of the church we attended and his wife to come to dinner one evening. As we were eating, stupid me, had to tell about how I worked my way through college as a dishwasher, a food server, and then a janitor. The pastor's wife, an Indonesian lady, said, why would a college student stoop to such work? You see, the Indonesian concept is you get education to get out of having to do that kind of work. My wife ordinarily would not do this, but she did make a mistake this time, and she said, why would somebody be so proud they wouldn't want to work to get a college education? Well, you see the difference. I was proud of working. My wife thought it was the perfect thing to do, but the Indonesian thought it was something that was really beneath the dignity of a person who was educated. Sociology will help us to be on the watch of that. Notice we'll try to find out why another group feels a different way than we do. A group of missionaries went to a culture in Africa where they used bride price. Bride price is a certain amount of money and goods given by the family of the groom to the family of the wife to be. It's not, the missionaries thought, oh, that's buying a wife, that's bad, and told the people not to do it. The people gave in and marriages began to break up. The missionaries didn't realize that bride price in that society was a way of building stability into the marriage, and it was a good thing, not a bad thing for them. How about polygamy and monogamy? In Africa, many societies allow and encourage polygamy. It's usually done to allow more wives to have a husband in societies where there's a shortage of men, but Western people seem to say, oh, that's not the way it ought to be. The different society will look on it differently, and society would help us to see those differences. So here's another matter of society help. Now, element 6. Sociology is the study of why things remain the same and why they change. 3 aspects of stability. How do we maintain order in a society? And what are the advantages of doing it? When things stay the same, we know what to expect. how do we participate in social change without destroying our society? A good change would come, as it did in the matter of segregation, where the laws that supported segregation were declared unconstitutional, but we're still working out some of the tensions that have developed from that. Sociology does not allow us to be indifferent. We see the complexity of social problems. We must agree to some way to try to resolve them. So this is important. Now, the next slide gives a little bit of a discussion of a change that came about in the culture in America, and that is in the matter of women working outside the home. The fact of the matter is that when I was in high school, most wives lived at home and took care of the home, and the men made the livings. But that changed. One thing that brought about the changes is that the women had to go to work during the war, World War II, and they learned they could do it, learned they liked it, and then culture made it so that it was so expensive for a family to live that one breadwinner could hardly do it. So we had a change from more women living at home and women working outside. Element 7 is social institutions. These institutions, these ways of doing things that help us to get along. Notice that a social institution is an organized pattern of beliefs and behaviors that centers on basic needs. It is a special way of doing things, such as a family, and the family may be different in different cultures, but there'll be a family, there'll be a government, there'll be education and religion and social control, the military, the police, and groups and organizations such as health care and retirement plans. But there'll be these different institutions. We'll study them later. There are two forms here that can help you to think a little bit about this. I'd like for you to look at the second one. I noticed that even in the very open and tolerant way of our students in this school, that where we show a picture of young men wearing their trousers very low, there's very little tolerance for it. We're willing for the girls to wear revealing blouses, but we don't like the boys wearing their shirts low. I have noticed a difference in my kids, and all my kids smoke. But they have changed. They used to smoke in the house, but they changed and started going outdoors to drink. I think that we're seeing a bigger move toward not drinking until you're intoxicated. When I grew up, tattoos were only very low-class people had tattoos. Now, many people, most nice people, have tattoos, and they're quite nice looking. When I grew up, no boy would have thought about wearing ear jewelry, earrings. Now we see it quite often, and I enjoy teasing about where all the piercings go and the jewelry goes on ears, all over the face, it seems like. We used to be very careful about revealing clothes. We are a little more lenient now, and I don't know that that's a bad thing. I do get a little bit of amusement out of watching our people going out and purposely purchasing jeans with holes already in them when you could buy jeans less money that don't have holes. This is a matter of cultural change. Look at slide number 90. It is telling us that sociology and employment. Can sociology get you a job? Not too often. There are social service organizations that would look at your degree in sociology as good. Some community work. those who are in corrections and criminal justice can make a great deal of work of use out of sociology. Business, college settings, health services, social work can really be a good career. Others, but the main thing is that sociology can help you do your job better. What you learn in sociology can help you do a better job of fitting into your culture and your job, and it's to your advantage. This ought to be the most practical course you take. If I do it right, that will probably lead to it. As we went through here, this matter, I tried to think about ways that sociology contribute to you, and you will do some work on that, but go back and look at things and think, now how will the study of sociology contribute to me, make me a better husband or wife, child in a family, worker at my workplace, schoolmate, whatever organization I'm in. And then finally, we say a sociology major who got a pretty good job, and I have appreciated the way she's acted in the job in these last years, so it's not a total loss. This is the commentary to go along with unit number 1.